Jackson County recently held a workshop on the integration of non-lethal predation tools and methods into county wolf management strategies. For those of you who couldn't make it, here's an overview, or watch the entire workshop at jacksoncounty.org.
The purpose of this workshop, it's an educational workshop, and that's what, and we're focused on what the role of non-lethal methods in predation management with a focus on wolves. Now, I know as soon as I mention wolves, you know, that there's a lot of opinions, a lot of strong feelings either way about wolves, and I just want to direct people to say that we're not here to discuss whether wolves belong on the landscape. This is a workshop on dealing with the realities of wolves on the landscape, because that decision of whether wolves are going to be on landscape, that's already been made by the state of Oregon, and it's already played out and continues to play out as far as how they should be managed and what have you. But non-lethal is certainly a component of the state's plan to manage wolves, and that's what we're going to focus on today.
Well, great. Well, hi everyone. Thanks to Dave and Rebecca Ward and all the other folks who helped organize this and for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm really excited to be here. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today. So Dave asked if I could talk a little about some of the tools that we've been using in the Northern Rockies to try to reduce livestock predator conflicts. And so I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing, which is primarily focused on protecting cattle and sheep from wolves, bears, and coyotes. And I'm going to talk today about 3 tools: range riding, permanent electric fence, and fladgery. And I hope the fladgery isn't too repetitive of what we've already heard earlier today, but I'm going to spend some time going into a little more detail about it and end my talk with at least an attempt at a sort of virtual demonstration of the steps involved in setting up fladgery and using it, some things to consider, and some of the equipment involved. And what I really hope is that you can all leave here today feeling like if you are interested, that you yourself could go out and purchase fladgery and know where to get it and know how to use it and know how to set it up successfully. Before I get to the tools, I did want to echo this theme that came up this morning that both that John, Julie, and Stuart all touched on, which is collaboration and how important it is. All of the conflict prevention work that NRDC and I have been involved with over the last several years has been in collaboration with many other people, but especially in recent years has been in collaboration with Wildlife Services. And this is a photo, this is a photo of, as Julie mentioned, a photo that she took of on the left there is Ted North, a field specialist with Wildlife Services up in northwestern Montana, and myself after a day of setting up fladgery. We decided that we needed a photo of us shaking hands across the fence. And to me, this is kind of a remarkable photo. Many of you may be aware that NRDC and Wildlife Services don't see eye to eye on everything. And in fact, there are a lot of things related to predator control that we will probably always strongly disagree about. But I think what this photo captures, and what is a really important point to make today, is that we haven't let those differences get in the way of talking about and working together on the things that we do agree on. And, you know, I think that, as others have said this morning, probably most all of us in the room today share an enormous amount of common ground in terms of wanting to prevent conflict. Because when we can prevent conflict, we can reduce property damage, we can reduce worry and loss of sleep, reduce controversy, and reduce loss of life, both domestic and wild. And so I think we're all here today to try to achieve those things. And I just wanted to make the point that collaboration has really been a key ingredient to achieving those things in my work and to the success of our projects. So talking about the tools then that I've been most involved with, the first one is range riding. And so what is range riding? I think that there are probably as many different definitions of range riding as there are range riders, but basically they are shepherds for cattle. They're folks who are hired to spend a lot of time keeping a close eye on herds of cattle and taking active steps to really do what they can to reduce the risk of predation. And this is a photo of probably one of the most experienced and knowledgeable range riders in our neck of the woods in the Northern Rockies, Hillary Zaranek, who many of you may have met or know of. And I think she would tell you that that it's really important to understand that range riding shouldn't be this idea of someone sitting on horseback and sort of sitting around waiting for things to happen to react to, but instead that the best thing a range rider can do is really be proactive and really be out there doing things and taking steps to affirmatively reduce the risk of predation. And those things include riding in the early mornings and late evenings when predator activity is higher, removing sick or injured animals from the landscape if possible, removing or managing carcasses. What I mean by managing carcasses is oftentimes it's impossible to remove a carcass, but a rider can often move the herd a distance from the carcass to reduce the likelihood of interactions with predators or scavengers who are drawn to a carcass. A rider can also throw a tarp over a carcass if depredation is suspected and take other steps to secure that carcass so that it can then be investigated and confirmed as a depredation if that's what it was, and so the rancher can then be compensated for that. Another important thing that a rider can do is use particularly low stress handling methods to gather herds together, to keep them bunched, to keep cows and calves together, to settle the herd at night. Oftentimes when you are able to settle a herd in a particular spot in the evening and they're calm and relaxed and happy to be there, you'll come back the next morning and they're right there in the same place. And it's so valuable and advantageous to be able to keep a herd together, as folks talked a little bit about this morning. Predators like wolves typically will try to get their prey running and in order to bring them down. And when a prey animal stands its ground, which it's more likely to do in a herd, then a predator like a wolf is less likely to attack it and less likely to be able to kill it. So being able to work with herds to keep them calm and together is really helps in reducing predation. A whole day or even week could be spent talking about what low-stress livestock handling methods are. And in fact, Hillary has been holding now a series of range rider trainings in the Tom Miner Basin where she lives and works that we've helped organize a little bit. She's invited people from around the West to show up for a few days or even a week and learn more about range riding, low-stress livestock handling, things that a rider can do and think about to help prevent conflicts. And if that's something that anybody here is interested in participating in, I'd be more than happy to connect you with Hillary and get you signed up for one of her next classes. So of course, another step that a rider can take is to observe predators, watch for their sign. When they do see a predator, to deter the predator both just through their human presence, but also through hazing, like shouting, clapping, waving their arms, etc. And a really important aspect of range riding can be reporting what the rider is seeing to the ranchers that they're working with and to the community that they're working with, so that everybody has a little more awareness, a little better understanding of what's going on the ground. So riding can be done by horseback, on foot, by ATV. I've heard of folks, being out there on mountain bikes. it's a lot less important what method of travel you're using, and more important to really be out there, be present, and be taking those active steps to reduce predation. There are a number of range rider programs taking place and emerging throughout the Northern Rockies and the West. The one I'm most familiar with is, again, where Hillary lives and works, in the Tom Miner Basin, just north of Yellowstone Park. Another project is happening in the Centennial Valley in southwestern Montana, in the Big Hole Valley, in the Blackfoot Valley, as Stuart was describing, in the Upper Green River Valley in northwestern Wyoming. There are conversations happening about a new program starting in the Boulder River area, south central Montana. There's another project that I hope that we can help start next year in the far northwestern part of the state in the Tobacco River Valley. And I know that as part of the Wood River Project in Idaho, there are riders in Washington, or at least one program that we have Mark Coates here with us today, who's leading a rider project in Northern California. I believe riders have been used in Oregon. So these programs are happening and springing up in more and more places, and I think it's because they can help. Like any tool, range riding is no panacea, but we've seen it work in places in the Northern Rockies. The project I'm most familiar with, again, is in the Tom Miner Basin, where it has a varied terrain, everything from open grassy meadows to thick coniferous forests up high, and it hosts the whole range of carnivore species, from mountain lions to black bears to at least one resident wolf pack over the last several years, as well as one of the highest densities of grizzly bears in the lower 48. And yet what we've seen in the Tom Miner is, during the past 5 years that the project has been going on, among herds of cattle that the riders have actively monitored and worked with, there have been 0 confirmed wolf depredations, and only, I think, 2 or 3 confirmed grizzly bear depredations. And those numbers are a lot lower than they were prior to the beginning of the project. So there's no question that, at least in the Tom Miner, the riding is helping, and the community is really happy about it, and it's really a fun project to be a part of.
I have a question.
You bet.
This has been running through my mind, and I'm sure some of the other people here in the area have the same question. How much of that country that you're familiar with would be like that forested country? Is quite a lot of it, or do the cattle gravitate out towards the open? Or because our country here, driving down I-5, you can't tell where we're running our cattle. Our cattle are like that.
Right.
And they spread into groups of, 10, maybe a dozen out of, say you had 200 cows out there, they're going to be in small groups that who knows where they are. The wolves do, but I'm just trying to visualize range riders trying to monitor, 20 groups of small groups of cows like that. And I was anxious to hear your presentation, because I figured you could probably give me some pointers.
Yep, so there are a couple questions in there. One, how much of the country in the Tom Miner looks like that? And the way the Tom Miner is laid out is that typically the cattle spend, April, May down low in the open grassy meadows, and then come late May, early June, they're moved up onto the public allotments, which is the terrain that looks like that. And then they're there until late September and come back in October. And I think that one of the keys to success in the Tom Miner is the amount of time that those riders are out there spending on the allotments, which may or may not be feasible everywhere, but they're out there twice a day, every day, checking those cattle. And I think it's through that frequency that they're actually able to maintain most of the herd, if not all of the herd, together even in such a densely forested area.
So
And
they're
they're
herding those animals like you would herd sheep then, essentially, it sounds like. I mean, if they're keeping that, a big group of cattle bunched up like that, they're moving them, if they're out there up that.
Yep, they're moving them a little every day, and
In this part of the country, we don't, I guess maybe we don't manage them at all. I don't know, we don't manage them like that, though, We may not be out there for weeks at a time.
right. And I
Okay.
think that's the key is the significant amount of time. So in the Tom Minor, which is an area that's comprised of just 5 ranches, the project has hired 2.5 riders, so 2 full-time, 1 part-time rider. So that means a fairly high rider to cattle ratio. I think there are a couple thousand head total in the basin. And so that helps them keep a really close eye on all the herds. And I do agree with you. It'd be a whole different story if they were trying to do the same thing, but not trying or not able to be spending as much time up there on the allotments.
They don't keep all those cattle bunched into, 1,000 head of cattle, they've got to be.
No, it's multiple herds. Yep, but they try to get to each herd twice a day.
Wow.
Yeah, it's committed riders. Yeah, for sure. And happy to talk more about that later as well. So the next tool I thought I'd spend just a couple minutes on is permanent electric fencing. Many of you are probably familiar with it, know more than I do about it, probably, but I wanted to mention it because it is such an effective tool, particularly for bears, but really for a wide range of wildlife, and useful in so many situations. Everything from chicken coops, protecting fruit trees, livestock feed, compost piles, garbage bins, calving pastures, livestock pens, outhouses, gardens, cabins, apiaries, and more. And one of the recent projects we were involved in was working with Montana Wildlife Services and Defenders of Wildlife and a major honey producer in south central Montana called Sunshine Apiaries. They were experiencing some higher rates of black bear depredation around some of their bee yards. So we went out and worked with them to install several permanent electric fences around some of their bee yards, and in the hopes that those would reduce both black bear conflict. It's also in an area just north of the Beartooth Mountains where we expect grizzlies to show up eventually as well. So we hope that it will reduce and prevent conflicts with both species of bears. But again, I just wanted to mention this because it was just such a positive and rewarding project to work with some non-traditional partners on and be a part of, helping a business, helping wildlife, and working with colleagues in the conservation community as well as working with wildlife services. Just as a side note, we installed 3 different types of fencing around these bee yards. One was a 5-strand fence, and then 2 were regular wire panel fences. And we did that to just see if one may work better than the others, but a month and a half later, there have been no conflicts, so they seem to all have worked well. So I'd like to spend now a little bit of time talking more about fladry. Earlier presenters have touched on it. I'd like to go into a little bit more detail, talk about a little more about what it is, where it's useful, where it's not useful, and want to start out by allowing Mike Foster, who you see here, who's the State Director of Wyoming Wildlife Services, to answer that question, what is fladry? And this was a video that he and his staff made in Wyoming when we were working with them last year on a project outside of Jackson. And this was a really ugly situation where on the Walton Ranch, wolves were killing cattle, and Wildlife Services was killing wolves as a result with the permission of the Fish and Wildlife Service through kill permits. And this was going on in the weeks and days leading up to this project, and the day we put up the fladry, the conflicts stopped. And for the next 3 weeks, which was the amount of time the producer had asked for protection to get his cattle to shipping, there were no more conflicts. And so again, it was a really positive and just a great project to be a part of. So I'll let Mike take just a couple minutes here to explain to us what Fladry is.
Today we installed a product called Turbo Fladry. The purpose is to try and help to keep wolves out of this pasture right here where we've got some cattle that are experiencing depredations. It's one of the tools that we have in a big bag of tools that we use to manage wildlife depredations, and in specifically wolf depredations. It's an electrified polywire, and it has plastic flags that hang off the wire. And you know, we installed about 2 to 2.5 miles of fencing today, and we're excited to see how things come. You know, the hardest part might have been just the fact that it takes a lot of time to install a product like this. It's very labor intensive. It seems to work in smaller pastures and over shorter time periods. We are looking at a short time period here today. We're only looking to get protection for about 3 weeks. It doesn't work in every situation. It doesn't work in large pastures or certainly not on public allotments, grazing allotments. But I'm excited to see how things go here.
So that's a little hard to read. I'll just read it. So it says, Fladry is a tool used to protect livestock from predators such as wolves and coyotes. It is made of a line with brightly colored flags hung at regular intervals. For extra protection, the line carrying the flags can be electrified. This is called Turbo Fladry. Because wolves are afraid of new things in their environment, like fluttering flags, they're cautious about crossing the Fladry barrier. So as some of the presenters this morning explained, and as Mike just explained, at the risk of being a little repetitive, Fladry again is a cord that can either be electrified or not electrified. When it's electrified, we call it Turbo Fladry. It's basically, you know, draped with these rectangular nylon flags that can be a wide variety of materials. And it's typically used in pastures that are less than 100 acres or so. This pasture that we were on in Wyoming was about 120 acres, and that was kind of pushing the limits of where Fladry is really usable. It works in a couple of ways. First, wolves and other predators tend to be neophobic, so afraid of new things in their environment. So when they suddenly come across a barrier of fluttering materials like this, they'll tend to not want to approach it or cross it. And then after a period of weeks or a month or two, if they do get brave enough to approach it, typically they'll touch the line to test it with their nose or even bite at it with their teeth. And at that point, we hope they get about a 10,000 volt shock that buys us another several weeks. Junko Industries, which did not pay me to put their logo on here, but they're the one manufacturer that we know of in the US that makes Fladry. And I'm actually going to pass this around just so you can look at it. So Junko recently sent me this sample of the types of materials that they're actually able to make fladry from. Everything from a sort of lower end nylon to polyester with the UV coating to a thicker vinyl. They're really willing to accommodate whatever sort of material or flag length or spacing or color that you are interested in having. And the default design that they'll send to you is 18-inch flags, so this length flag spaced 18 inches apart on a poly wire like the one that's going around. But as Julie alluded to earlier, Wildlife Services and others are starting to look at whether different lengths and different spacings may work better in different situations and for different predators. So far, we've always relied on the default design, but I'd be interested to start using different materials and lengths to see if different types may work better in different places. So I'd like to send this around as well.
So, Zach, those are non-conductive. They're not, the flags have no charge to them.
You know, just a tiny bit. And so I want to talk about that a little too, with considering what kind of energizer to use.
And do you have to worry about shorting it out?
Right.
Okay.
And if you don't mind, I'll get to that in just a second. So it's really important, as effective as fladry can be, it is really important to point out that it's a very specific tool designed for a specific situation, and it has its strengths and it has its limitations. Among its strengths, fladry has been demonstrated to be effective against wolves and coyotes. It could be effective with bears as well. In all the projects that I've been involved in, or most all of them, have been in black and grizzly bear country as well, and we've never had a bear go through a fladry barrier, but I don't think it's been studied as much or as specifically as it has with wolves and coyotes. Fladry is a lot less expensive than trying to build a permanent electric fence of the same length. It can be installed more quickly than a permanent fence, and it's portable. It can be moved around if need be. It's not ideal once your fladry is installed to be moving it a whole lot, but it can be moved if need be. If cattle need to be moved to an adjacent pasture or something like that, we've been able to pick it up and move it fairly easily to the next pasture. And it's pretty tough. It's tougher than it looks. It lasts a number of years. And in fact, I have on one of the tables over here a handout with the estimated cost according to Junko's estimates of mile of fladry in these different materials that they offer. And you're looking at anything from a couple $1,000 for a mile to several thousand, depending on the type of material you use, which sounds high at first, but if thought about in terms of several years that it lasts, and especially if it's protecting your animals, it can be pretty affordable and worth the investment. Fladry also has limitations. As I mentioned, it's only really suitable for smaller pastures of 100 acres or less. And that's really for two reasons. One is because it becomes challenging trying to electrify fladry that's more than a mile or two long. Because the rule of thumb that we generally stick to is trying to have a 1 joule energizer per mile of fladry. And so technically there's nothing stopping you from putting out 10 miles of fladry, but you're then talking about having 10 chargers out there on the landscape, and that becomes expensive and really impractical. And then secondly, fladry requires some maintenance. So ideally you want to be out checking on it every week or so to make sure it hasn't fallen down or hasn't got knocked over by animals, that the charge is working, that a branch hasn't fallen on it, that sort of thing. So ideally, you're using fladry in a situation where you're trying to protect a smaller size pasture. Another limitation is it can take some time to put up, a few hours to, depending on the size of the pasture, to a day, depending on how much help you have, the kind of terrain you're working in, and and again, the size of the pasture. Should be checked weekly, as I mentioned, and it shouldn't be left out more than 2 or 3 months. It's a tool that in part, as I explained, relies on its novelty as its deterrent. So if it's left on the ground for more than 2 or 3 months, predators could become habituated. They could learn that they could scoot under it or jump over it, and we don't want that to happen. So what we found is that, especially when it's electrified, it can be out there for 2 or 3 months, have its deterring effect, and then taken down and put out again 9 months later, and it seems to continue to work. So given these strengths and limitations, what we're finding is that fladry tends to be a really ideal tool to protect something like a calving pasture, where you're trying to buy enough time for those brand new baby calves to grow big enough to be able to stay with their moms once they're turned out to pasture. And they tend to be, the calving pastures are often small enough to be able to encircle with fladry, and so that's the kind of situation that we've found ourselves using fladry for most often. Just to share some results of some of the projects that we've been involved in recently. So in 2016, NRDC teamed up with Wildlife Services in a sort of first of its kind collaboration in Montana, and decided to work together to install fladry around several calving pastures in western Montana. Over time, that project, over last year and this year, grew to include pastures in both in Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. At this point, we've probably installed fladry around a little over a dozen pastures, different pastures. And in all of those pastures, one of the criteria we were using and looking for to identify places to work were places that were experiencing ongoing conflict. So either in the recent past or actual, experiencing conflict, as it was happening. And because we wanted to work in places where we thought that where we could invest resources in actually making a difference, and where we would be able to tell whether the fladry was working or not. If the conflicts continued, then obviously it wasn't a useful tool. And in every one of those pastures, once the fladry was installed and as long as it remained up, we have so far not experienced a single conflict or loss or depredation in any of those pastures. So far we've been 100% successful. And in part, as a result of that, I think we're seeing a growing interest, especially in Montana, from ranchers who, especially our neighbors, with the folks who've been using fladry. We're hearing more and more that they also want to work with us to try it on their calving pastures. And so we hope to keep the project growing and expanding in the Northern Rockies and to other states as well. And to help us do that, we're now talking with Montana Wildlife Services about actually sort of jointly hiring a dedicated non-lethal technician to do a lot of the fladry work and other permanent fencing work, given the kind of increasing demand and need for someone to do that work in Montana. And so it's a really, just again, a really fun and productive and rewarding collaboration to be a part of, working with Wildlife Services to help it hire a sort of first of its kind position that we can all agree is a great thing. And related to that, as we've worked more and more with Wildlife Services and talked about other opportunities to prevent conflicts, we're also talking with the agency about hiring a range rider to help us start the project that I showed you on that map up in northwestern Montana next year. Wildlife Services may actually be the agency to hire the rider to help us get that project started, which would be another first for the agency. And again, something that is a win-win for everybody. So really exciting to be a part of that effort in Montana.
Hey, Zach, can I ask a quick question on, do you know which Farm Bill program NRDC is funding? Or no, you're NRC now.
Yeah.
I was thinking NRCS.
Yeah, NRCS. Right. I would like to figure out how to get more funding from NRCS. Okay, so at this point I want to switch gears a little bit and actually do a sort of virtual demonstration combination of slides and kind of showing you some things that are up here on the table, kind of walking through the steps that are involved in using Fladry and installing it, some of the things to consider while you're doing that, and some of the issues that we've run into. And I mean this to be a little more interactive, so please feel free if you can't see well to come up along the sides and take a look as I'm walking through some of this. So imagine you've gotten to a point where you've been convinced that Fladry is worth trying, that you've found a partner to work with, a ranch to operate on. You buy your equipment from Junko Industries and from your local fencing store. You show up to the pasture and you ask, okay, now what? How do I get started using Fladry? And fortunately, this is not rocket science at all, and it's pretty straightforward. So step one is you start at the entrance of the pasture you're working in, and you pound in a T-post. Can people still hear me if I'm away from the mic? Okay. So this is a T-post for anyone not familiar with fences or electric fencing, which is probably no one in here, but you want to pound in a T-post. You want to attach your T-post insulator at about 30 inches off the ground if you're aiming to deter from wolves. We figure 30 inches is right about shoulder height on a wolf. It also happens to be nose height to a curious wolf, because if they're looking to investigate something, they've probably got their neck extended, and we figure 30 inches is just about right for a wolf. Or if you're looking to deter coyotes, probably more like 20 inches, which would be somewhere around here. Pound in your post. It's as easy as tying on your Fladry, the poly wire of your Fladry to your insulator, and you're off and running. Step two, once you've got your kind of anchor T-post pounded in, one person can then start pounding posts around the perimeter of the pasture. You basically only need two types of posts. At your corners and at your gates, you use T-posts to be able to handle the tension and the weight of the Fladry, which can get a little heavy over the course of miles because of the weight of the flags. Otherwise, though, you're able to just use these lightweight, pretty affordable fiberglass posts. I think these are 3/8 inch and 4 feet long. These work in pretty much all types of terrain, unless the ground is either frozen solid or really rocky. We've actually used rebar posts in those situations, but for the most part, you can use these fiberglass posts. They're a lot tougher than they look, and they're pretty light and work well. And I usually space them out 20 to 30 feet apart, and on each one, so getting ahead of myself. So step two then is to pound in your posts around the perimeter of your fence. And in fact, I'll send this around as well if you want to.
Zack, about how long do you get those to last?
What's that?
Fiberglass posts.
Well, it depends on if you take the extra second or two to use the cap that the bundles come with to protect the tops from splintering, you can get years out of them. If you don't take the time to do that, and especially if you're using a regular metal hammer rather than a mallet, they'll splinter pretty quickly, which breaks the posts and fills your hand full of splinters, so it's no fun. So I've actually learned that a 44 caliber bullet shell works as well. It fits perfectly over those 4-foot posts, and so if you happen to have some of those laying around, that works well. But that's ideal, is to use those caps when you're pounding them in.
The thing you can use is a big rubber mallet.
Yeah, right. Mallets work better than hammers, for sure.
Rubber end on it.
Yep.
Yeah, but I guess I'm talking about lifespan in years. The sun tends to degrade them pretty well.
And are you talking about the posts or the Fladry?
The posts.
Yeah, see, I guess I haven't experienced that. I think we're still using a lot of the same posts we were from 2 or 3 years ago, but we'll see. So your experience is that they haven't lasted all that long.
They break down in the sun. They get those little splinters.
Yeah, yeah, we'll have to see. So step 3, as one person is out there pounding in posts, then another person can follow them and get out in front of them, laying out the fladry. And we've always found that it really works best to lay out your fladry and until you reach a corner or have done a length or one side of a pasture, and then kind of pull it tight so that you have some tension, so that as then the next person is coming along and lifting the fladry and hanging it on the posts, that tension is already there, and that person isn't trying to sort of keep tension in one hand as they're threading the fladry through the post. That makes life a lot more difficult. So we really try to always send a person out to lay out the fladry and tighten it up so that it has some tension as we're then coming along later and putting it up. And I did want to just point out that when you order fladry from Junko Industries, it comes in those rectangular cardboard boxes that you see in that picture on the left. And Junko does a nice enough job coiling the fladry in those boxes that you can actually just use the boxes for, when you're using the fladry for the first time. You can take those boxes out with you. It'll come out just fine. However, when you've reached the end of the project and it's time to take the fladry down, you do really want to spool it up. It's a tool that becomes, it's a type of material that becomes tangled up really easily. And just ask some of the bitter NRDC interns that I've had work with me to untangle piles of fladry. Even if you try to loop it around your arm and coil it that way, it just doesn't work very well. And so at the end of the project, you always want to spool it up. We used, so this is a spool that Wildlife Services brought in today. These are the cheap garden hose reels that we often use. They work great. We actually have also bought a couple of golf bag straps that you can attach to this with a couple of carabiners. Loop behind your shoulders, and it keeps it right about chest height so that if you're either unspooling fladry or spooling it back up, it works really well that way if you do have to be on foot, if you're working in kind of rough or vegetated terrain and not able to use a snow machine or four-wheeler or something like that. So once you've pounded in your posts and laid out your fladry, then if you have a third person, they can come along and actually attach the fladry to your posts. And the post I sent around has a rod post insulator on it. A lot of people, and I'd be interested to hear your experience, don't bother using an insulator on a fiberglass post. But I've read that fiberglass, especially if it's wet or dirty, can actually conduct a little bit of electricity. So we always try to use these insulators, especially because when we're out, putting up a mile or two of fladry, every little leak of electricity adds up. So we do attach these cheap insulators to each of our posts. They have these little hooks on them that's really easy to thread your fladry through. And yeah, so that's your step 4. Step 5, it's important to have had a conversation with the landowner you're working with ahead of the project to have asked them about gates. Whether they want just a single gate built into the fladry at the entrance of the pasture, or whether there may be multiple gates that they'd like built into the fladry. So that you know ahead of time kind of how many insulated handles to bring and how many gates to build. I didn't mention yet that typically in an ideal situation, you do want to install fladry kind of parallel to an already existing permanent fence, usually a barbed wire fence. You want to keep it far enough away from the fence so that those flags don't get caught up in the barbed wire and get torn to shreds. but it seems to help having it up against that and parallel a permanent fence, just to add to create a sort of double barrier that a predator is even less likely to want to mess with. Gates are easy to build. I've got a sort of one here. If you can kind of work with me and imagine your fladry coming along to where you want to build a gate. It's very easy to simply tie a couple of, to loop your poly wire a couple times around your insulator, to cut the fladry and tie a loop, attach your handle through the loop, tie your poly wire to the eye of the handle, and then tie this end to your other T-post. You always want to use T-posts as your anchors for your gates. And loop this end a couple more times and tie it off at the insulator on the other T-post. And then you're off and running again. And you've got a nice gate built in. It's always helpful to have the gate in your fladry be wider than the gate in the permanent fence that you're paralleling, just kind of for ease of access. And it's always nice to remember to have your handle and the opening of your gate at the same end as the handle and the opening in the permanent gate, just kind of for ease of use. And for those who haven't come across one yet, I'll hand around an example of an insulated handle. So step 6, once your fence is up and your gates are built, it's time to energize your fence. This is getting back to the gentleman's question about things to consider when energizing fladry. We have tried a couple of different types of energizers. The one in the top right of the screen, those smaller fence post chargers are sure convenient and nice to work with. But what we found is that they don't pack quite enough oomph to charge anything more than a quarter to maybe a half mile of fladry. Again, because of the little bit of leakage that you're getting through the flags, especially if the flags happen to be touching vegetation. And so we've leaned more towards using bigger chargers like the ground-mounted one you see in the bottom left. And the difference between those two is the joule rating. So the charger in the top right has a joule rating of 0.1 joules, and the charger at the bottom has a rating of 1.0 joules. And again, we try to stick to the rule of 1 joule per mile of fladry. Your joules are basically a measurement of the power that your Energizer has to push that pulse of electricity through the fence and maintain a high enough voltage to actually deter a predator, which we think needs to be about 7,000 volts to really get their attention, and if need be to create a shock that actually goes through the fur of an animal like a wolf or a bear. So we're always aiming for 7,000 volts or higher, and to do that we need about a 1 joule charger per mile of fladry. Maybe the most important part of the whole fence is your grounding system and your ground rods. This is simplistic, but basically the way an electric fence works is wherever you are on the fence, whether it's a person or an animal, when they touch that hot wire, the electric current passes from the wire into the body of the person or animal down into the ground, and then the current has to pass through the ground all the way back to your ground rod, where it then comes back up to your Energizer and completes the electric circuit. And when that circuit is completed, that's when you receive the shock. And so if you don't have a good ground rod in the ground for that electric circuit to come back to, you're not going to receive much of or possibly even any shock. And so what we always try to do is buy these nice kits of 3 6-foot rods. We pound all 3 of them into the ground right near the charger. We keep them 5-10 feet apart, and we pound them all the way into the ground, 5-5.5 feet deep, sometimes sometimes all the way in. You can connect them together then with the clamps and the wire that they come with, run your wire back up to your Energizer, and you've got a completed electric fence. Step 7, turn on your Energizer and hope for the best. Usually if you've done all these steps reasonably well, it works great. You'll want to then use your handy dandy voltmeter to test your charge. Test it at a few places right near the Energizer and then along the fence to make sure you don't have any shorts in the fence. These cheaper ones are pretty simple to use. They just come with, one end is a steel rod that you put in the ground, the other end is your clamp that you clamp to your fence, and it'll read out the number of volts that it's kicking out. They make, a whole range of voltmeters. Some are so fancy that they'll even tell you what direction the short is coming from, but these cheaper ones have always worked just fine for us. Step 8, of course, is to take a group photo and prove to the world that you were able to get along for the day and put up a fence. And I really like this combination of photos. They're both from last year. The first one is after the very first project that I did with Montana Wildlife Services up in northwestern Montana, and the second photo is taken from the last project of the year that I did with Wyoming Wildlife Services. And after finishing in a kind of thunderstorm, we looked back to see a rainbow over the top of the pasture we just encircled with fladry, and we hoped that meant it was going to be a good sign, and it turned out that it was. So this is my last slide, just a photo to show your basic fladry toolbox and essentially what you need to build your fladry, and also just to mention that if at all possible, four-wheelers sure make life a lot better if you're working on the kind of terrain where you can use one to help you move a little faster and haul equipment around. And that's all I have. Thank you.